We all have challenges in life: sadness, broken relationships, anger, bullying, grief, and isolation. But there is hope. Together, we can learn how to bring back joy, re engage with life, restore relationships, and to be alone without being lonely. Welcome to Psychology Talks.
Thank you for joining us back of how to help your kiddo with a trauma experience, or how to help them recover from a trauma experience, with Dr. Rob Lusk. He is the clinical director for the Baby Fold. He is also an adjunct faculty member at Illinois Wesleyan University, and he is a longtime specialist and expert in trauma treatment. So we are very glad to welcome you back to finish talking about this really important topic. You've told us a little bit about how we can remove the child from that activating environment. But what are some other ways that maybe we create physical or emotional safety for the child, when maybe not always when they're just activated, but at other times as well?
That's such a great point. I think in general, most of and there are several models that are evidence-based that are used by therapists to treat kids with trauma. In general, they all pretty much focus on a couple of factors as critical. One is the relationship with caregivers. Typically that's parents, but obviously it could be foster parents or even residential staff, et cetera. It also involves teachers, daycare providers, et cetera. But it is critical for the caregivers to, in a sense, develop their own ability to stay calm or emotionally regulate when the child is triggered or when the adolescent is triggered, or they'll never be able to get to that emotional safety part. Mm-hmm. So, what does that mean practically? Well, parents need to be able to stay calm even when their child is triggered and maybe yelling at them, saying very hurtful things to them, maybe breaking a window, putting a hole in the, things that are huge triggers for parents. And understandably, as a parent, we all want, we don't want our kid to be in distress, or we certainly don't want our house to be damaged like that. And so this is really tough, but the idea is parents often need to do a fair amount of work themselves, and sometimes teachers and other adults do too, on examining their own, why is this triggering me so much? Why is this such a big deal for me? Is there something in my history maybe that this child's behavior is triggering? Because a fair amount of the time when kids act out, most of us as adults can kind of go, okay, it's a child, they've been traumatized, I get it, I can deal with it. But sometimes they will do things, and you'll just hear parents or teachers say things like, that just was so triggering, or that got on my last nerve, or, I saw red when she said that, or something along those lines. And so it's sometimes really important for the adult to do some individual work, sometimes with a therapist, on their own emotional reactions if the youth's trauma is kind of more triggering than it should be to them, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So that idea of, well, for physical safety, obviously the adult has to stay calm, because when do adults hurt children? Generally when they get super upset and they're in hyperarousal. For emotional safety, the idea is a calm, nurturing environment where if you, quote, lose it, which we all do to an extent, mm-hmm. there is no physical safety compromise, and we go for what's called repair and connection. In other words, my kids are adults now and don't live at home. And so, when they were here, yes, I would get angry at them at times because I'm human, but what I would do after, I would make sure that they didn't get too angry. And when I would get upset or say something that I regretted, raise my voice or something, I just always went for repair afterwards. You just, I'm sorry, I got upset and I said and did things that I didn't mean. And I genuinely, apologize, and I don't feel that way. And we can do some problem solving to try to help me avoid doing that again in the future. because this is my issue in a sense, you know. So repair, like that as it's sometimes called, and connection, which is just making sure that you really attune to the child, really listen as completely as you can, and listen for the kind of hidden or under the surface emotional messages. So when, for example, I work with a fair number of adoptive parents, and one of the biggest triggers for them, understandably, is when an adoptive child says, I hate you, I want to be with my real mother. You know, I've had many adoptive moms in that case say it feels like a dagger in the heart. That makes so much sense. What you, and you know, nobody, I can't say, well, just let it roll off your back, because that would hurt anybody. So the idea is, okay, that hurts and it hurts bad, but before I react, let me put it in a context of what has he been through, or what has she been through? What's going on here? You become, you know, an emotion detective, as it's sometimes called, where you're kind of going, okay, I'm seeing this behavior, but what's the emotion underlying it? So my daughter is very upset. She's very frustrated right now. She may be scared. When she says she hates me, she wants to be with her, quote, real mom. What is she really saying? Right now, she's, you know, she's saying a bunch of complicated stuff, but no, that is not the real message. That's a message that she only gives when she's really upset, when she's not in her frontal lobes, et cetera, that kind of thing. So
finding out what triggered that response.
Yes, yes. And so if an adult can stay calm and do that, they will, that's more than half the battle in a sense, because just by acting in those ways, you will create emotional safety for the child, and chances are there will be a lot more willing and motivated to practice the grounding and coping techniques that they need to be able to move on to that next treatment stage.
Yeah. And I'm assuming that creation of that physical or emotional safety also has a lot to do with the environment. So if it's an environment that's really triggering, if there's something in the environment, maybe it's worth exploring whether or not that aspect of the environment is removed. So maybe there's pictures or other things that, you know, maybe it's been in a family abuser that created the trauma situation, or figuring out those pieces just practically. Or maybe there's other aspects to, you know, if it's a child that's in foster care or that's been adopted, you know, maybe a piece of that emotional safety has to do with, you know, figuring out what level of involvement there can or should be legally or ethically or responsibly with biological family members or other aspects.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a great way to look at it. And that is, if anything, it's not easy to kind of pin down, but if anything, if you can help the child feel emotionally safe, and sometimes that even means creating a safety bubble at school, for example, the child's reality may be, right now at home, things are pretty bad. Their, you know, parents are in survival mode, et cetera. And so sometimes adults have to do that in limited situations. It's hardest, I think, for therapists and counselors, because sometimes we may have the child 1 hour a week or something like that. So the idea is, right here, right now, while we're together, let's try to forget about all that stuff and just focus on you and kind of create this artificial emotional safety bubble.
Yeah.
That's asking an awful lot.
Yeah, I've seen teachers do things like have a tent in the corner in their room, or have a reading nook where children could go, and maybe having, you know, fluffy bean bags or whatever it is, where they could sit and just kind of decompress for a moment. My child has some issues with deregulation at times, and so in school he would go outside and do push-ups in the doorway of the classroom where the teacher could still see him, but it was, you know, creating a space where he could have some privacy and still have that sensory input from the heavy work that he was doing, and that was really calming for him. And so I'm sure for some of these children with trauma, that same kind of thing can be helpful.
Absolutely. And flexibility is key, flexibility for the adults. In general, it's kind of a silly thing to say, but the adults have to be more flexible than the children. So in your son's case, for example, that was wonderful. And yet you could imagine so many, what if everybody wants to do push-ups? And my response is usually, then you will have a healthier class. It's like, what's the big
Right.
But yeah, the idea that, as you suggested, the environment often has to be, and if we can accommodate for the trauma survivor, let's do it. And I've had this discussion with a lot of parents and professionals, and I get it, the idea of, well, that's an awful lot of accommodation, or that, boy, we're bending over backward for this child or for this student or whatever. And, what I try to remind them of is, well, for one thing, usually we're not asking you to bend over backward. It's usually pretty simple stuff, and chances are your whole classroom could benefit from this. So you probably wouldn't really have to just do it with this student. You could probably do it with anybody who wanted to, and you'd be fine.
Yeah.
And secondly, these kids have been through things that your other students simply probably wouldn't dream of in some cases. And so their experiences are different. It's okay to treat them a little bit differently. Yeah, we want them all to be able to play by the same rules, but the only way they've got a shot at doing that is if we're somewhat flexible and meet them halfway or a little farther until they develop those skills.
Yeah, absolutely. So once you've decided, yes, this kiddo has some issues related to trauma that really need to be addressed by a professional, how do they go about finding one?
That's such a good question. Again, there are different ways of doing it. I mean, there really isn't one specific place where, like in some, I guess, specialties, you might say, okay, here is the place to go and here's where everybody is listed in a sense. And unfortunately, it's not that easy. I think, most people will advertise, at least in a listing, for example, on Psychology Today, which is probably the most popular therapist website, whether they have a specialty in trauma. What I recommend, because trauma is so common and so many children and adults have experienced it, and therefore just about every therapist works with trauma to an extent. I mean, it's very rare for any therapist to say, oh, you've had trauma, I don't think I can deal, because it's just half of what a lot of us deal with in a sense. And so I think it's really important for clients, and in this case, parents, to interview the therapist, which sounds funny because when we go to providers, we tend to sort of think, oh, they're willing to see us. Well, thank you. And of course, I appreciate you and you will help me the best way possible. As you hopefully have recognized over the years that, professionals have, within one profession, sometimes have very different areas of focus or expertise. And so what I want to know is how much trauma treatment have they done? What trauma, or ideally what evidence-based, which means there is good research behind it, treatment model or models do they use? How do they decide on what treatment to use with a child in this case? How will they look at progress? How will they monitor progress and let you know that looks like things are getting better, or decide with you things are getting better or they're not? Because you can get so many different approaches, and with therapy, the connection with the therapist is still clearly the most important thing, in a sense that we have some control over, if you will. Techniques are not as important as the connection, but the evidence-based techniques do have good research behind them, suggesting these will help people better than some other types of more generic approaches. Because the idea is talking about trauma can often be helpful, but there are focused ways of talking about it. And with kids, sometimes it's even a different modality, as it's called, or way of doing treatment, where you're doing play, as I mentioned last time, or something very, very different.
So you want someone who's experienced in doing those things, who understands the differences between what it is to work with a child with a trauma issue versus an adult with a trauma issue, about that there can be some pretty big differences in how children express that trauma reaction.
Absolutely. And any professional that you're seeing for something like this is, a lot of us feel like we're somehow stepping on toes by asking questions like, I'm not suggesting that you grill them or challenge competence. It's just okay, explain to me what you're going to do and how this is going to help and how you're going to measure that. And if they're able to do that in a way that you're satisfied with, then chances are you are okay. If not, if you're thinking, well, that didn't make sense, or I have more questions than answers, that's not a good sign in my experience.
Yeah. Well, and how can a supervising adult, a parent, a guardian, whoever is in that child's life, support them in between sessions? Because like you said earlier, the therapist is only going to have access to that child, 1 hour, probably once a week or once every 2 weeks.
Absolutely. Well, and that's the beauty of doing trauma work with kids, assuming that they are in a family or systems, which they virtually always are, is that then you've got adults who can hopefully do that work, a lot of that work outside of therapy. In other words, especially the stage 1 work, the creating the safety and the stabilization that I've talked about, that is something that therapists certainly can teach and coach parents and kids about how to do, but practice is by far the best way to accelerate that process. I think about the piano lesson analogy. If you take piano lessons, and if you're like me, the only time you practice is about 10 minutes before your piano teacher shows up, you are not going to get better, and when it comes to the specialized part, it really is the trauma processing piece that I've alluded to, that second stage trauma processing, that a therapist really, in a sense, has to be in charge of, although parents can even participate sometimes or help in that part of the therapy. But when it comes to the first part and then the supportive stuff that goes along with that second part, the therapist in some ways is as much of a coach as the one actually making the changes. And so if the parents and the child are willing and able to run with those ideas, you can make far faster progress and more efficient progress.
And so what I'm hearing you say is that the role that the guardian or parent is taking in that child's life as far as the treatment is concerned is that they have a very active role that starts from the time they recognize what's going on and what the need is, all the way through the willingness to be coached and learn from the therapist, to work with a team. So this is, it sounds very much like a team approach. Like you're going to have a whole team of people that are going to be supporting this child from the time they wake up to the time they go to bed. And if there's nightmares involved, then it's even after they go to bed. So having that whole, like a treatment plan that can be utilized for 24 hours a day by whoever is coming in or out of that child's life throughout that day. And then there being some willingness, like you said, for that, the responsible party for that child to then be willing to learn and be open to listening to the feedback from the other people and how strategies are working and how to implement other ones, and to really come alongside that child and really walk with them as they're learning all of these different things. That means you're learning them too. You're learning how to do the grounding. You're learning how to do the deep breathing. You're learning how to do the nightmare resolution pieces. You're learning all of that stuff. And then you're supporting the child as they move through them as well.
Yes, that's a great way to summarize it. And so when it comes to emotional safety and physical safety, obviously, just as you've said, a therapist will provide those things for 1 hour a week. But if parents can provide them and teachers can provide them for all those other hours, then you will establish those things far faster. And if those other adults can also help the youth practice the coping techniques and just be supportive, do those problem-solving kinds of interventions after they get triggered, it will go much, much faster. It's sort of like holistic health, the idea that, is a physician responsible for your child's health? I would hope most parents would say, they're responsible for a tiny portion of it in a sense, but no, we're responsible. We're not going to just we're not going to sort of sit back and say, okay, we have no responsibility for how our child's doing here. Parents have, the ability to make or break physical health just like psychological health.
Yeah. Well, and I think that really kind of transitions us to resiliency and because that's where we're building resiliency in these kiddos, right? And that's what we want to see. We want to see some recovery. So can you talk about what research says about what recovery can look like, or how many children can recover? Or I guess that's a poorly worded question, but but I think you get my point that that there can be recovery from these situations. It doesn't have to be something that they're plagued with throughout the rest of their lives. So what does research say about that?
Yes, and it really suggests, it's so hard to say because research on treatment outcomes is difficult to do for a bunch of reasons. But when a child's family participates, so just for the reasons you were talking about earlier, outcomes are extremely good. They tend to be in the 80+% resolution. In other words, about 80% of the kids, if their families are invested in the treatment, end up resolving their trauma to the point where they have no significant issues whatsoever afterward. The others may still have some remaining issues, but tend to be doing better. Trauma treatment, at least good trauma treatment for youth, is remarkably effective for the most part. Sometimes it takes a long time, but the good news is, in general, there's a lot of evidence that the younger the trauma survivor gets treatment, the better the prognosis. So the idea is if a child is traumatized, they can get treatment at any point in their life, but if they don't until they're an adult, it's probably going to be more difficult for them to resolve the trauma than it would have been if they had done it as a child.
So as soon as the person responsible for the child recognizes that it's happening, get them into treatment.
Absolutely, yeah. So outcomes are pretty good. There are not, when it comes to medication, it's interesting because for adults, there are some FDA Food and Drug Administration approved medications for PTSD. There are none for children. And so all prescribing for kids is off-label, as it's called. In other words, you can prescribe, but there isn't FDA approval, so it's kind of experimental. So psychotherapy really seems to be the best approach for children. Medication can help, no question, but it's not as effective apparently as it is for adults.
Any last thoughts that you have for us on how to help, or what parents can do or teachers can do?
I think the point that you were getting at of how parents are the true healers is such an important thing to emphasize, because parents, sometimes people, and I used to be more guilty of this, I think I've pretty much gotten over it, the idea of, okay, well, if your child has a psychological problem, a therapist will fix it, this is clearly a systems issue. Trauma is a systems issue. And yes, children can benefit tremendously from individual therapy, but having parents get involved and having parents being willing and able, it's not easy because we're asking them to do homework, and nobody likes homework. But if they're willing to do that kind of work in between sessions, it will make a huge difference, and kids will improve faster and improve, overall significantly better. So I think recognizing that you are the expert on your child, and if you are willing to do that kind of work, which again is not easy. Would I rather drop my kid off at somebody's office and pick them up rather than doing the work myself? Yes, but the reality is that's a necessary part of it. So I'm glad that you really emphasize that, because parents are the key in this situation, but teachers and other adults that the child spends significant time with can make a huge difference as well, both positively or negatively if they're not trauma-informed.
So do you know how many public schools tend to do teaching or education for their staff about trauma or how to help kiddos that have experienced trauma?
More and more states are mandating some kind of training. So Illinois, for example, just I think it was last year or maybe 2 years ago now, I'm not sure about others, but I've heard this, about some others, is mandating it for teachers and so, or for school staff.
Mm-hmm.
I've gone into a whole bunch of public schools, at least in the central Illinois area in the last few years. Public schools are very, very interested in getting this information. They have so many competing demands, and now with the pandemic, it's been even crazier to try to provide that. But they are very open to it, and in some places, it's being mandated, and so that can make a big difference. I've had teachers just, really talk about how their eyes were opened in a sense when they learned more about it.
Well, thank you so much for the work that you do, and thank you for coming and sharing that with us. I know this has been really informative for me, and I hope so for our audience as well. And so thank you, Dr. Lusk, for that. And thank you for joining us on Psychology Talks. Please visit our YouTube channel and remember to subscribe and like.